Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about Chapter 3.8, the modern aesthetic, realism to expressionism. This is, for me, the most exciting chapter in the book, where everything happens in art, in my opinion. Everything changes in art, and so many different styles happen. So let's look. So the second half of the 19th century saw rapid changes. We have railways, steamships, industrial growth, electricity. More people are moving to cities rather than staying out on farms and things because less people are needed to run farms with electricity and machinery. And then we see a lot of growth as far as wealth, and we see an expanding middle class. So people in between the wealthy and the poor. And these people will have a little bit of money, and that's important to note because we'll see art styles just for them. And one of the more important things for art happens, and that is the invention of photography. So with all this happening, artists are going to respond with multiple forms of experimentation. The whole world is changing. Why not art? Artists are going to explore the impact of formal qualities. So that's the whole first section of the course that we looked at, breaking everything up into line, color, shape, value, texture, repetition, movement. Artists are going to go back to that as, or go to that. We're going to go back to that. They're going to go to that as a means of making art. Up until then, it's been about making paintings and sculptures look like things or people. So this is going to be very revolutionary. But in this chapter, up until the very end of the chapter, it's still going to be representational. And I want to clarify that. It means it will represent things that are in the world rather than just in the artist's head. It will be abstracted. It will be expressionistic. It will convey mood or emotions with symbolism, but it still will be based on actual things for now. Academies are government-sponsored institutions, schools, where artists could be trained with other artists. So you would go and apply to an art school, an academy, and you would want to study with a certain artist. So you would go to that academy. And these people that work in this tradition are the people that will exhibit in the salons, except for people who are not accepted either into the academy or into the salon shows. We're going to see artists break away from that tradition and do their own thing. So this painting, you don't have to put this to memory. This is just an example of a painting that would have been very well received by the salon. Would have won a lot of awards, and it's called Birth of Venus. And you can see it is a typical classical subject, or we can call it now an academic study of the female nude being passive. It's mythological. You see the little putti or angels floating around her. It's very much like a Greek sculpture or a Renaissance painting, say something like Botticelli. And this would have been the best in show for the salon. And you can see here that Manet's painting of Le Déjeuner célèbre is very different. That means a luncheon on the grass. He's French. And we see in a park setting, there's very many parks in Paris. It's a modern subject, so this is like a modern setting. It's not some mythological place. It's a park in Paris. And we see Parisians, figures that people who saw this painting might recognize. And it was scandalous because the woman who stares out at us would have been recognized as a Parisian. not as some faceless mythological figure. So Manet, of course, was rejected by the salons, and he started his own salon. It's called the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused, or the people who were not accepted into the salon or the academies. And so here he's making fun of the tradition of the academies. He's showing a female nude, which would have been very well received in the salons, except she is not passive. She's not in a pose that seems idealized. She's a recognizable figure, and she engages with us. Now, the book, I think, writes it's an aggressive stare, but I feel like it's just she's looking at us. Right, so there's the Salon des Refusés. And this marks the beginning of modern art, modern setting, modern people, modern style, modern take on it. Realism is another style that happens at the same time. And this shows everyday people, mostly the lower class or poor people. And in general, it didn't have a political agenda. So it's not like a rebellion against people being poor. It just shows them in detail doing their work as humble, almost heroic figures. So we have Courbet here. We have the Stonebreakers. And we have these two, an older man and a younger man doing their job, which isn't a very glamorous job. Their clothes are all tattered, but you can see they're heroic. They have figures that are muscular, almost like a Michelangelo sculpture. Right? And this is a very big painting. If you can see down here, it's 5'3" by 6'8". That is a gigantic painting for just two figures. So very Michelangelo-like. Courbet himself called himself a realist. So he's purposely doing his own thing, calling attention to it. Right? Depicts the working classes. And this is an important thing to notice because we would have had historical or religious figures. They're on a scale of that now. Millet is another realist. This is called the Gleaners, also a very large painting. And gleaning is when the fields have been, all the good stuff has been taken away, all the hay and wheat, and they are left to just glean whatever's left for their own. And again, you see these giant heroic figures working the land, everyday people, heroicized, elevated to the level of other art subjects we've looked at. Photography cannot be overlooked as one of the more important things to happen, probably for humanity, not just art history. But when photography started, a lot of photographers wanted to use it as an art tool. That seemed to be the intention. And there was debate about, can photography be considered art? Because the artist isn't painting it, he's not sculpting it. This is so new. People didn't know what to do with it. But what photographers wanted to do with it was make art. So we have an early Degas here. This is a little bit before the realists. And he's making a landscape. Right? And we're going to see portraits, still life. So early photographers tried to imitate what was being done in painting. So here's a portrait, of course, Abraham Lincoln and his son. And we're going to see photography as a tool for many things, one of them being political. Lincoln had 40 photographs of himself taken, And he credits photography with helping Americans get to know him and support his politics. Right? So can we consider this art as propaganda? We can hopefully make some or recall some things that this might have in common with, say, pharaohs or kings being having portraits made, sculptures made, and put all around. Roman generals having busts and sculptures put around to show people who they were, right? To sort of gain a little fame with the masses. The only flip side of this is that there's no idealization. A photograph is a photograph at this time. Now we have sort of, all the Adobe products to help us with manipulation and filters and things like that. But there can be no idealization at this time in photography. So there's the little glitch there. You are who you are in a photograph at this point. Thomas Eakins is an American artist who used photography for many different ways. He liked to experiment with photography. Here he's showing motion. So this is a little bit different. We've seen paintings try to show implied motion, but when it's a photograph now, it is actual motion. In a way, it's still a two-dimensional thing, so that's kind of a strange double-edged sword. But Eakins did what most artists came to the conclusion of, whether they liked photography as an art form or not. They found it to be incredibly useful as a tool to make art, right? So you can take a photograph of somebody and use that to make a painting from for a portrait, rather than them come to your studio every day for weeks on end until the portrait was done. So very quickly, the tables turned and photography becomes a very popular thing with artists as a tool to help them in their painting and sculpting. It should be noted that Thomas Eakins went to and taught at the American Academy of Art. That's the actual title, not American Art Academy. It is in Philadelphia. It is the oldest art school in America, and it is still in existence. It still goes on today. So art is happening in America, but in general, it's at this point imitating what is happening in Europe. Most artists would go on a grand tour. They would go overseas and go all over Europe and study the French, the Italians, see what was going on, and come back to America and try to imitate those styles. But over in France, we have plenty of Americans going over to France to study. In France, another thing that is happening is Impressionism. Impressionism rejects the American or the academic tradition. And I put it as a little footnote over here. They were also rejected. They were told that their art was an impression of art, or that's an impression of a painting. That's not a real painting. And so they started their own salons. They were also salons de la refusée. So they're rejecting the tradition. They show scenes of everyday life, often painted en plein air, which means they would go outdoors and make paintings out in the atmosphere and the sun and study the effects of light and atmosphere and color. They would do quick sketch-like brushstrokes with their paint. And some of them studied optics and color theory. Like, how do we really see color, light, air? This is a school or style that was shared. So these people got together in the cafes of Paris and sort of decided like this was a thing, or they would come to each other's studios and influence each other, right? Rather than the competitions of, say, the Renaissance, artists are sort of a collective now, sort of huddled against the salon or the academy. It should also be noted here, it says scenes of everyday life. This is a slide from the textbook. It's not for it's the middle classes. It's the middle classes doing middle class things. So it's leisure time activities. This might be in direct opposition to realism, right? This isn't the gleaners or the stonebreakers at work. These are upper middle class people enjoying themselves in Paris, right? So we have Renoir, who's one of the more famous Impressionists. This is Moulin de la Galette, or the ball. This is a party. They're outside. So leisure time activities, outdoor, en plein air, and we see the effects of light. They're sitting under the trees, and you can see the light sort of speckled around them, right? And everybody's not standing heroically posing. They're all in movement. They're all naturalistic, right? So it's like a snapshot. And that's important to note because people are seeing snapshots now. They understand what that is. You can see that people are cut off, right? I didn't crop this slide. This woman is half her face. So you can tell that artists are directly influenced by photography. This is an important note. And here we have it. It's meant to evoke a world of beauty and pleasure. This is not realism. Claude Monet, another very famous Impressionist, he really liked to study the effects of atmosphere. He was a little obsessed with it. He also owned a giant house in the south of France, Giverny, and he had all these beautiful gardens and bridges and ponds where he could go out and study and make paintings. And this is a giant room in France. It's the whole room. It's like a rotunda surrounded by like a panorama of his paintings. This is a bridge from his estate. And you can see this is not a clear, crisp, photographic, right? The artists are being influenced by photography, but in a way they kind of go overboard, trying to call attention to the idea that a painting is made of paint, right? We can see these giant brushstrokes of thick paint sitting on top of other thick paint, all these tiny little brushstrokes everywhere, the texture, right? So now we have the formal qualities to talk about. We talk about texture and color and value. This is a watercolor that Monet did, and you can see he liked lily pads and ponds. And this is a really good example of almost abstraction, meaning it's still representational. We still see that it is lily pads on a pond with trees, but formally, it's sort of broken up into big areas of different textures and swirling colors and light. So the formal aspects of art are being paid attention to, not just the subject. And this is not in your textbook, but this is a great example of what Monet liked to do. He made, I can't remember how many of these, dozens, I think, of the cathedral. Remember those from the Gothic era. Right, so we have this cathedral here. It's the same cathedral, same place. He just went out every day and studied the effects of light. So he repeated the same subject. So he tried to capture atmosphere. And the Impressionists, some of you are writing your papers on this, the Impressionists were very influenced by this influx of Japanese prints that were coming into Paris. All these exhibitions were coming in, and the Japanese show that took place right around the same time as the Impressionists influenced them as far as the point of view. A lot of Japanese wood block prints have a tilted perspective where the floor seems to be tilted up so we can see everything that's happening. And artists like Mary Cassatt, here on the right, an Impressionist, she worked very much with people like Degas. They sort of just stole the format. So we see the world is becoming a smaller place, with art traveling back and forth from places and influencing artists. The bold outlines of the Japanese, some artists would sort of start taking this from them. Flattened space, bright colors, busy patterns. I should say Impressionism has, with Berta Morisot and Mary Cassatt, who I just showed, has female artists as part of their group. So that's kind of a newer thing. There's very few, far in between female artists who were even allowed to make art. Both were wealthy women who had time on their hands to make paintings. You wouldn't see the woman in the Gleaner's painting having time to make paintings. And this is a great example of how uh, the Impressionists are trying to make or call attention to the idea that a painting is made of paint, right? You can see all of the brushstrokes here, and this girl walking seems to be sort of immersed in paint. She's sort of like swimming her way through this stream of paint. And the two women, Berta Morisot and Mary Cassatt, did like to paint mothers and daughters. They would have their children with them a lot of times, so they made them their subjects. This is a little bit different. He worked a little bit later than the Keiyo-butt, worked a little bit later than the Impressionists, but you can see he's very influenced by both Impressionism and photography. So we have this high contrast reflection here. We have two figures here. Right, so the composition is almost broken in half. This is a street scene in Paris, a rainy day, so he's concerned with atmosphere and weather. And you can see the cut-off snapshot quality of this. So he's definitely using a photograph to work from. And this painting is gigantic. It's almost 7 feet by 9.5 feet. So it's similar to, say, something what the realists were doing, but these are the upper classes out in the street enjoying a rainy day in Paris. Post-Impressionism is not a style in its own right. Impressionism certainly was. Post-Impression, it just means it takes place after the Impressionists. And there are 4 major figures to look at, and these 4 don't have anything in common other than that they worked after Impressionism and they were influenced by it. And they make similar choices as far as how to observe the formal qualities in a work of art, but they really are 4 very unique artists in art history, or they're their own school in a way. Impressionism was criticized for lacking substance and being too preoccupied with depicting beauty. So in a way, that's almost like an academic thing to try to show beauty. Post-Impressionists want to differentiate themselves from this simplicity, and they emphasize the abstract qualities of subjective content. So the first one we look at Cézanne, who lived in the south of France, and he painted Mount Sainte-Victoire, which was from where he lived, over and over again. He repeated the same subject, different angles, different times of day, different scales. And what Cézanne liked to do is break everything up into more geometric shapes. You can see all these sort of like cubes and triangles. And this is a very important point because an artist in the next chapter is going to see Cézanne and take that very thing and make it into something else. So it's abstracted, it's not realistic, it's based on the thing still, it's representational. We see a mountain, but it's not meant to be photographic or realistic to look just like the mountain. It's stylized. Gauguin, in my opinion, is one of the most important artists of this time period because of his use of color and his flattened shapes. So he is not concerned with making everything look incredibly three-dimensional. It's almost like flattened, like a Byzantine painting before Giotto. This is the Vision After the Sermon, and these are um, people from Brittany, where he grew up, religious people. You can see the religious garb on them. This tree just cuts a whole diagonal through the whole composition. And this is Jacob wrestling the angel, so it's a religious topic. But right away, I hope you can see that what the heck is all this red here? He is using non-descriptive colors. He's making the ground red for an emotional impact. The ground is not red. It's not supposed to be like some kind of clay or something. He's making his own choice about color. It's not representational or descriptive. And this is a very important thing. The Impressionists said, well, we don't ever have to ever have everything sort of static. We could try to make it look like it's moving or have the atmosphere, right? So this post-impressionists look at Impressionists and say, well, if they can make all these choices, why does color have to be representational? So because art is directly seen by other artists, right? Gauguin is French. He would have seen what the Impressionists were doing. We can definitely correlate what he is doing is taking his lesson from the Impressionists and going in his own direction. And here's his Yellow Christ. So non-descriptive colors with typical subject matter from the Renaissance. Probably the most famous, not just post-impressionists, but famous artist in the world is Vincent van Gogh, and that's his painting Starry Night. Beautiful. Your book makes a good little comparison with our portal artwork, The Great Wave. You can see some very same visual similarities. That is not to say that Van Gogh saw this woodcut. He most likely never even knew about it. Vincent van Gogh lived with Gauguin for a brief time. They were what we might call frenemies. They annoyed each other. This is his view from his window during his stay in an asylum. Van Gogh had a very tragic existence. He, now we know, he was, not well mentally. He had a lot of physical problems too. We've covered this in another chapter, The Night Cafe. This is in the color chapter about complementary colors. But here we can see the tilted angle. So what the Impressionists have been influenced by the Japanese wood prints, so has Van Gogh. But he calls it, he does very similar things to the Impressionists with like breaking things up, like this would be light broken up into brushstrokes. But somehow the way Van Gogh puts everything together creates anxiety rather than like a feeling of beauty or pleasure. And we know this was his mental state, right? Van Gogh actually cut off his own ear, and this is the asylum that he was sent to live in and eventually died in. The other post-impressionist we look at is Georges Seurat, who really did something so different that only a few artists have done this style after him. Whereas Van Gogh or the Impressionists, lots of artists try to imitate that. This is called Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of La Grande Jatte. You can just call it Sunday Afternoon. This style is called pointillism, I think this painting was in your color chapter. And what Seurat did was he made all these little dots. All this texture is like tiny little dots. This is a giant painting too, which makes him insane in my mind. But he would take one dot of color and put it next to another dot of color. Say he would put a red next to a blue, and from a distance he would think that the eye would see purple. And mostly he did it with value tones, right? He would put, this would be like a purple skirt, and he would put red and blue dots in it. So it's not just purely like one color next to each other. And it almost looks like a blurry photograph, right? We see the cutoff points of views. In America at the very same time, we have Tanner, banjo lesson. This has been in other chapters. And he's sort of like a combination of impressionism and realism, right? It's very realistic because it has realism, I should say. It's a man with tattered clothing doing an everyday thing, teaching his grandson how to play the banjo. Tilted point of view. So we see art styles traveling and being assimilated into other art styles. And at the end of the chapter, we look at expressionist artists, ways of showing emotions, focusing on inner states of feeling, exaggeration and emphasis on colors and shapes, and non-representational. This is Kandinsky's painting, and he would title all of his, because he considered them to be music or like music. So this is an improvisation, or he would call them compositions. Always like number 30, like if you Mozart's whatever prelude number 20 or something like that. He was one of the first artists to really try to make painting about the formal aspects. Color, line, shape, texture, value, those are all there, even though there's no real subject. One can make a case of, yes, this looks like it's cannons and this looks like it's buildings, but really he's dipping his foot into abstract expressionism, which we will look at in the next chapter.